All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the security rabbit hole to yet another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. I'm Raf. Two squares over from me that way is James. See, I got this right now, James.
Right on your screen, not right on my screen. You're right in the middle on mine.
Well, you
So
just gotta you can rearrange your screen to be like
I,
mine then.
I can you rearrange it?
Yeah, you
I
can just
can't.
drag and drop the boxes, bro.
Oh my gosh, what the heck? When did
Isn't
that
that
happen?
amazing?
This is amazing. That was one of the things I loved about Zoom, that you could move people around.
See, the Boomcaster platform just keeps evolving, man.
It's
They're on
I'm
V2
telling
now.
you
You
what.
got some all kinds of good stuff now.
It's the
I
little
can even
things.
I can even blur backgrounds, but I don't like my background's perfectly fine. I don't need to
Oh
blur
yeah,
anything.
yeah.
You guys can read what books I'm reading. Oh, wait, that way, and my that way. There you go. The my shrine to the number 30. Anyway, speaking of moving this along, thanks for joining us, guys. We've got another fun episode for you. Uh, with all the interesting stuff happening in remote work and technology evolution and all the interesting things that go with that, I thought I'd bring on Steve Riley. And Steve, jump in, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just kind of start talking. That's
Yeah,
what we
thanks
do.
for having me on, guys. It's going to be fun. I'm Steve Riley, Field CTO at Netscope. I've been here a little over 2 years. I joined from Gartner, where I was a cloud security analyst.
Oh, you're one of those.
Yeah, and I wrote a Magic Quadrant and a market guide, but whatever. That was
Okay,
years
then
ago.
we're done here. Steve, what's a field CTO?
um, well, it's an interesting job. I like to kind of joke around and hope this is received in the way it's intended. I don't build anything. I don't sell anything. I don't manage anybody who builds anything or sells anything. Maybe that's from a movie. I don't remember. But what I have to do is, um, you know, generate ideas that other people find useful in getting done whatever it is they need to get done. So, you know, I bring to the job 25 years of infosec experience. I've been involved in cloud security since the beginning, 2009. And I love this world of ideas, and even taking existing ideas and trying to cast them in new ways so that perhaps new insights can be revealed from that sort of thing. And
You
as a
just
part of my job, I get to touch every dimension of Netscope's business:
that's kind of fun.
marketing, engineering, sales, customer
Ooh,
success, and that's what's fun.
yeah. You just said since the beginning in 2009, and my brain hurts. Have we really been doing this cloud thing that long?
Amazon S3, 2009.
Wow. I think I recall kicking around like the original reference architectures for this new concept called cloud computing, like early and mid '08. Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it would. I mean, EC2 was also in 2009,
Okay.
where the ideas finally started to become reality.
I think we were kicking around the shared responsibility model as a
Yep.
PowerPoint slide.
Hmm.
I remember Hoff posting it a bajillion years ago. Him and Rich were working on it, and then like everybody commented on it. I think that's my first recollection of what would become the waking nightmare that is cloud computing these days.
Yeah, and I wrote one of my early research notes at Gartner was on the same thing.
Wow. So listen, we've as nice as it would be to talk about semi-modern technology,
Mm.
there's still this Walking Dead zombie apocalypse out there of old stuff that's sort of the Walking Dead of technology, if you will, right? The
Yep.
the things that died, just that nobody's told them yet. And I know you wanted to touch on particularly on this concept of remote access, but I want to start with VPNing
Mm.
because whenever to all of us old school nerds, as soon as you say remote access, my brain first goes to dial up and then the VPN, right? Because I used to dial into things that when we
Yep.
actually plugged into a phone line and the coupler and the things
Sure.
back when pterodactyls flew in the skies, and then we evolved, and when we could configure Cisco VPN clients,
Mm.
which I'm glad that got easier because the original like technology was a great idea, but the execution was freaking hard.
Well, I mean, it, the goal was maybe in the early days actually to get people on a network, and that's what
Yeah.
dial-up and VPNs did. You ran an agent, you would make the connection, it would create a virtual NIC in your machine, and you'd receive an IP address.
Yeah.
But I think the majority of folks needed access to apps, not to networks. But in those early days, network was the only way to get to apps. So let's come up with a network way to do remote access. And so you see all those protocols like PPTP and L2TP and IPsec are oriented around getting people on networks. And I think those days of putting people on a network, that's no longer really the goal. Maybe it was actually the wrong goal from the beginning, but there was no alternative.
That's interesting that you say that. Because that's crossed my mind, but I don't think I've ever spent any time thinking about it that way. You're right. The original, I mean, but there were times where you just wanted to get dropped in, like you wanted to be at the office without sitting in the office, right? Which meant access, because everything was internal back then, back in the old days, back into before times.
Yeah.
You had your Exchange server, God help us, in the environment. You had your file server, right? You had everything, your antivirus server, your workstation connected to. Everything was internal. And so you did need access to it. But here's the thing. What we didn't want, and we got as a side effect, was all the contractors that would connect in, or support staff or whatever, and get access to the network.
The whole network.
Yeah. The entire thing. And we tried like stupid human tricks with firewall rules where you dropped into a DMZ and then you could only go to certain based on, like, that was later. I feel like we've been unwinding that monstrosity, and we've had some breaches as a result of that ever since. Now, at what point did we? Okay, let's start here. Is the access to a network concept, is that dead or is that dying?
Well, maybe it was wrong from the very beginning.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
if we are acknowledging in the remote access scenario that what we really need to do is mediate interactions between humans and applications, why shouldn't we do the same thing on a local access network, local area network? Why should I have an IP address that can take me everywhere in the world and not have access to that gated by what I need for my job role, right? I mean, yes, I'm in engineering, but should someone who isn't in engineering have access to the source code that runs our data planes? Probably not. I'm just using an example. I don't actually know what level of controls we have for something like that inside Netscope. I just haven't explored. But if we think about early attempts at trying to reduce the surface, even for internal users, those were like network admission controls. But again, it was all about the network, and it relied on things like 802.1x, which is easily spoofable on a wired network. I even wrote something about that based on something else I read a long time ago. So whether we're talking about local access or remote access, I think the right conversation is, how do we make sure that I should say the correct conversation, because I'm going to use the word right a lot. How do we make sure that the right people have the right access to the right resources at the right times for the right reasons? Forget about what the network looks like underneath that. That's where I think that we should be headed toward.
Is that where Zero Trust takes us? I mean, is that kind of the premise behind Zero Trust, though? It takes it away from the network idea and puts it more onto there is no local network. It's just, these are apps you're going for or certain resources you have access to. Does that tie to that, or is that kind of a stretch to pull that?
It's not a stretch at all. In fact, in my mind, the best way to design a CorpNet would be to treat it as if it were the internet. I don't want DMZs. I don't want internal users. I want people, regardless of where they plug in, if it's the Ethernet jack in the office or the Wi-Fi at a coffee shop, or in my house is Ethernet jackets in the house, but I know most people have just Wi-Fi, and that's fine. Wherever you get your network connection, that IP address does not automatically confer a position of advantage.
Okay.
It's just an IP address. If you want to interact with a resource, you have to present yourself to that resource. The resource has ways of assessing who you are, who your device is, maybe other signals too, like time of day of week, data sensitivity level, geolocation of the human and the data. And then you make a determination of how much access to grant at that specific time.
Okay.
And what's beautiful about this is the application and the data owners get to control that, not the infra guys anymore. I'm sorry, Raphael.
No, that's okay. So I'm thinking, and I'm gonna keep interrupting you because my brain just suddenly
That's
says
cool.
say something. I think the reason that we got to network and didn't start at like the internet cafe kind of idea originally, right? I think is because we didn't have the ability to put policy on the remote things that we needed.
Sure, that you're right. That didn't exist
because that's hard, right? And but it's not hard to do. It's hard to do in a meaningful, dynamic way. And the reason VPNs showed up initially is because, frankly, that was the model, right? Like everything that was the network model.
Mm-hmm.
That was the office-based. Everything was here. And I think the transition point over the last 10 years or so, it's not just when people had BlackBerries and laptops. It's when the data that they were accessing, the applications that they were using, started being more SaaS than internal. Then they're not on internal servers anymore. They're out on the internet. And so it didn't make sense. I mean, there's still plenty of companies that make you run through from your house or your coffee shop to the internet, down to the corporate office, to an aggregator, and then out, because they enforce policy there. They enforce, filtering and all sorts of things. And I guess, look, and that model doesn't necessarily, if you're doing enforcement like that, as long as you're doing the enforcement, let's take that, I can say that's a given, right? So you're doing reasonable enforcement. With the amount of bandwidth we have today, like the T1 lines of old were $1,500 to $5,000, a month, right? Right. I remember putting them in; they were crazy expensive. Now bandwidth is, I've got a gig at home for $80. It's absolutely bonkers. But I don't think it's the bandwidth is not an issue. So then it becomes a thing of, well, we're doing this because we want to centrally control. But I think what's happened is what you're going to tell me, and I think I agree with, is that the ability to have a centralized policy and control infrastructure can actually be delegated to individual endpoints without losing anything.
Yeah. If you think back to maybe some of the academic approaches to how policy works, you'll encounter this notion of centralized policy decision and distributed policy enforcement. And actually, I think that actually makes sense to bring into, out of the walls of academia and into the real world. You want one place where you create those policies, and one place where a decision is made about who can access what under what circumstances. But then you want to distribute the enforcement of that as close as possible to where the data lives, as close as possible to where the users are. And it's that consistency of policy application across all lanes of traffic, across all types of users, across all styles of cloud, that we can now do with modern technology that maybe we wish we could have done 15 years ago.
When does that, I know there's a lot of legacy VPNing out there. When does it make sense to flip the switch between your VPN aggregators and concentrators that you have, and to go to we haven't talked about what the new model is yet, but to go to a more distributed model and a distributed access, centralized control model? Like what's the decision point?
Well, I think we actually witnessed that in the first 3 or 4 months of 2020.
Yeah,
right?
I knew you were going to say that.
Of course you did. And I don't need to belabor the history. We all know that now, but it was hilarious to watch how the Gartner inquiries suddenly changed, because everybody tried to scale up their VPNs, ran into problems, called Gartner. How do we make our VPN better? We don't really know. And then ZTNA came out, And so, people were calling back. It's like, hey, that looks like it'll work a lot better. Yep, it will. For 90% of your users, they
Hmm.
use web apps, they use browsers. It's that remaining 10%, that's weird. It's the service making a connection to the client. It's something that is a legacy, or I should say a heritage protocol, maybe, that you'll still need to keep your VPN around for. And we lived in that world for a little while where it was a mixed model, new and old. But with some updates to the newer models now being able to accommodate all directions and all protocols, I think it's finally where we can begin serious discussions about retiring all of the legacy stuff, legacy access stuff, I should say.
Legacy access is okay. So let's talk, because we haven't really we've talked about it. We haven't really named it.
Yep.
What is the what's the new thing? What's the thing that's going to take us for the next 20 years, maybe?
So early in 2019, I noticed that there were a lot of vendors building products based on a model from the Cloud Security Alliance called the Software Defined Perimeters,
SDPs. Yep.
SDP. But even then, even though it was from the CSA, the SDP had very much of an on-premises feel to that model. And what the vendors were doing was taking it a step farther and figuring out how to deliver a lot of these services from clouds. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to write a market guide about this. And when you write a market guide, you have to give it a name. Well, market guide for software defined perimeters sounded, well, I didn't want to co-opt CSA, right? I thought, wait a minute, I'm also seeing these products implementing zero trust principles. And I thought, hey, this is the principles manifesting themselves into something that people can buy or subscribe to. So I would call it the Zero Trust Network Access. That was my name. If I could do it all over again, I'd call it Zero Trust Application Access, because it's really what it's about, mediating interactions between humans and apps, not humans and networks. But it's too late
Okay.
now.
And yeah, well, yeah, and there are what, 5, 6, 9, 37 different nicknames: SASE, SSE, ZTNA, ZTE.
Well,
Uh,
ZTNA is the specific market that I just described, but it's not going to be a market much longer. It's becoming a feature of what Gartner calls SSE. So what is SSE? Well, SSE represents the merging of two previously separate markets, CASB and SWIG. They came together. In fact, I advocated for making that.
What is SWIG?
Secure Web Gateway.
Oh, okay. SW.
Web
Okay.
filtering. But
I thought you just made something up on me. I'm like, what the hell have I missed?
SWGs.
Okay, continue.
Yeah. Again, granted, I do speak in Gartner acronyms. It's just going to be the way to deal with it. But I'm happy to define things. Just interrupt. That's fun. But the authors of this SWIG MQ and the authors of the CASB MQ, I was one of those, noticed that these markets were combining. Vendors in each space were offering features in the other space. So we said at the end of 2020, these MQs are done. We're going to come up with a new converged one. And then I departed Gartner, and the people who took over decided they were going to bring ZTNA into that too. So now think about it for a moment. A complete full security service edge, SSE, runs from the cloud. It is a service that customers can subscribe to and send all their traffic. Doesn't matter whether it's SaaS, web, or private apps. In fact, I'm a big advocate for eliminating the distinction. Now, this is what I say about Netscope. Send us all your traffic. We will sort out what goes where based on the policies you define in our console. We're not making the decisions. We're enforcing the decisions you make. And we can apply the same policy engine and decision-making process to all lanes of traffic. Doesn't matter, SWIG, or it doesn't matter, web, SaaS, private apps. Don't want to make the distinction anymore. That's what SSE is. And then there's this whole thing called SASE, which is like combining InfoSec stuff in SSE with infrastructure stuff on the networking side. It's mostly SD-WAN these days, but SD-WAN includes things like routing and WAN-op and the other sort of things that were once upon a time distinct markets themselves, but are no longer.
Okay. Is this The hamster's thinking.
I
One
can
one of the
see the wheels spin.
That's the smoke coming out.
Yeah.
That's a different thing. Um, we mentioned before that one of the big trip ups for the move into something beyond VPN was this the non-human things,
Mm.
right? Non-human application access. Have we solved that, and how?
You mean non-humans accessing applications
Yeah.
like
So
windmills and things like that?
something I could have used literally 20 years ago, 22
Yeah.
years ago.
Well, remember that every zero trust strategy must begin with an identity strategy. Um, Now, we typically associate identities with humans, but identities can persist on machines, on devices, on things out in fields, like windmills and things in factory floors and vehicles. So all of these entities can possess an identity that can be then put forward when it
Right.
wants to make access to something. The 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 reality is, I think that the industry has done a great job of creating mechanisms for managing human identity. Non-human identity is more of a challenge. You know, they have passwords that can never change because good luck going out into the middle of an ocean and changing a password on an oil rig. So we need more and better ways of um, establishing and managing non-human identity. I don't want to claim to be an expert in that. I'm not. There are smart people who are trying to find ways to solve this problem. But once that non-human identity management problem is solved, then all of the rest of the tools ought to just work because identity is identity, regardless of where it comes from.
Okay.
Right. So if you're looking at basically bring kind of IAM into everything and saying, look, we're not doing it at like a networky type level. It is at identity based levels to be
Yes.
able to make all these decisions.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I like to give the example of, if Alice wants to interact with sensitive data and she's on a managed machine, she can go everywhere. If she's on an unmanaged machine, then maybe we want to bring in the classification of the data that app interacts with. If it's public data, sure, give her access. If it's internal data, maybe we give her read-only access. Non-managed, unmanaged machine, but she needs to look at stuff outside of business hours, right? If she wants to interact with confidential data, no access. In other words, we're saying if you want to work with confidential data, you can only use your corporate provisioned device,
Okay. Hold.
laptop, phone, whatever. I want to take that same principles and be able to do that with a non-human identity too. Right? Is this vehicle? Is this a known vehicle in a known spot? Is this a known vehicle in a spot that we've never seen it before, and we also know is suspicious for one reason or another? Then we reduce what that vehicle could do until we can, in some other fashion, regain some trust in it, to use a common word.
That change though, going from strictly thinking of an identity base to identity plus behavioral base.
Oh, yes.
Right, because
yes.
my identity doesn't change whether I'm on a managed device or an unmanaged device. My identity is still my identity, but the behavioral characteristics that I'm passing along is I'm on a less trusted device, right? So you're almost taking two different components and using those to make decisions versus just saying we're going off of identity. We're going off of identity plus environmental or behavioral or something else to make additional decisions.
Yeah, I mean, behavior is one of the many signals you can use. I like your notion of bringing it up to the identity level. When I see charts about all these different signals, they tend to group themselves into hierarchies with identity always at the top and device at the top. But you're making me think that behavior should be at the top too, because not only do we need to know who you are, but we need to know what you've done in the past. Both of those are equally important. You're right, James. That's good.
So let's talk implementation. Um, okay, if you're on you just gave me the segmentation there. If you're on a managed system that is so managed implies you have some sort of agent on that machine, some
Yes,
sort of
yes.
thing. Okay.
Mhm.
what if I'm logging into whatever thing from my phone or my iPad or my wife's laptop because I'm on vacation and I forgot mine?
Well, you don't have the agent, so you are therefore by definition on an unmanaged device.
Correct.
What else could we do? We could do the reduction in access, which is read only, right? That's one option. Another option could be shunt your session to a browser isolation chamber, so that what comes back and forth between your device and the destination is just pixels, right? You don't actually have the ability to download data from that. You can only interact with data, but you can, maybe in this case, we could give you read-write access, so you could submit some things. Another option would be, to switch over to a reverse proxy style, although for a variety of reasons, reverse proxies tend to break things, and browser isolation seems to be emerging as a better option. And then there's the newest one, this idea of enterprise browsers, but that would require installing something on the endpoint. So you'd have to acknowledge that someone could deposit a package running an enterprise browser on your wife's laptop, which may not be something that everybody is in favor of.
So I've heard that a couple of times. The hell's an enterprise browser?
It's a pre-configured browser that can connect only to approved resources and nothing else.
Didn't we do that via host files like a million years ago? Or is this something
that would
more?
be at the
Like,
whole
what?
system, though, right? Like
That'd
this
be the
would
whole
be,
system.
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
fair
I'm
enough.
thinking of this like if you get like Burp Suite, it comes with its own Chromium browser that's pre-configured to use a proxy, certain things like that. Like I'm guessing
I see.
this would be
similar.
similar, right? Like the company could say, here's all this browser can do, right?
Yep.
And you have to install it, and then it would give you access to that one piece.
Right. I still think browser isolation maybe is a little smoother because it doesn't require installing something on these unmanaged devices. You can leave it unmanaged, and you're getting a session. So think of it this way. Here we go. On a managed device, you have an agent. On an unmanaged device, you run browser isolation, and the browser isolation performs substantially similar functions to the agent. There you go.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Does this start opening us up though? Like the configuration behind this of, okay, I had identity access management and great. Like I know who you are, and maybe we leave it at the basis of you're either managed or unmanaged, but all these extra pieces, does it open us up for such complexity that that's where we're going to miss something? And we thought we had it more secured than we really did. And now we've got more openness than we thought.
Yeah, I need to close my door here for just a second. It does. And, folks have argued for a long time that identity is that complexity is the enemy of security. And I do not disagree with that at all. But if we accept as a given that modern styles of work require much more flexibility than when we assumed everybody was going to go to the office every day, if we have to acknowledge that people do need to strike a balance between staying secure and getting work done, which includes doing work on unmanaged devices, then we have to build security mechanisms that can accommodate all that. And you're right, it does mean we're going to be looking at many more things. It does mean we have many more configs we have to do in consoles. It does mean that there are more opportunities to make mistakes in those configurations, which attackers could exploit, right? Configuration vulnerabilities are far more prevalent than code vulnerabilities. So as we see tools emerge to help automate the analysis of those configs and finding where those mistakes are and helping you fix them, I think they're important. But what is the alternative? That we return to everybody on the CorpNet using stone knives and bearskins? I don't think we want to go back to that.
I think what we've done is we've traded flexibility, and this is the trade-off, right? VPNs were a simple thing to configure. You were either on the network or off the network. You were either accepted or you weren't. Now, as James pointed out, you've got a cornucopia of options. To flex my vocabulary just a bit, like you've got a bunch of options that are available to you And this reminds me of the conversation about cloud is I've given you a ton of options. I've given you a whole ton of ways you could screw this up. What are the safeguards? What is the secure by default? How do we do this so that the default isn't access everything? The default is nothing works until you give me specific access. Is that how it's done?
Yes, but interestingly enough, that is how IaaS clouds operate. When you provision a thing in IaaS, only you, the person doing the provisioning, can manipulate that. If you want to allow other entities to interact with it, you have to intentionally put them on the access control list for that. Now, the challenge is there are many more things you can provision in clouds that need identities associated with them than when we dealt with racks and servers in our data centers. And so that's why these tools that help you do effective analysis of access controls, that allow you to profile those, have got to be part of our habits. If we're going to create an access control list for something, we need to test what the edges of that access control might allow or block to make sure that we're back to what I mentioned earlier, all the rights, the right access by the right people, the right resource, the right time, for the right reasons. And it is possible. I just think it isn't habitual yet. And that's why we see, open buckets over and over again, because the habit is to be easy and to weaken the default by secure stance, or the secure by default stance.
But does it build off levels though? Because I mean, I could see if you're going to go implement something like this, your first stab is, one, you have to be identified, right? Like you have to have a valid identity to get any access to anything. And then if we want to lock it down corporate wise, you have to be on a managed device. Like by default, that's fairly secure in that stance, right? Anybody off a managed device, right? It's once we start getting to that next level of, okay, we have exceptions. Somebody needs to access this resource off of a managed device, that we now start getting into configurations of, okay, how do we, but if you start off at like level 0, right? Identity and managed device, by default, that's kind of a pretty secure start way, right?
Yeah.
Versus, opening up the other way and say, okay, we have to kind of lock this down, going, right, we're starting off locked, like you were saying, with some of that other stuff. It starts off limited, and you have to explicitly say, okay, I'm gonna allow somebody on an unmanaged device to get to this. And our rules for that are, if you're on an unmanaged device, you have to have X, Y, and Z enabled, or whatever. You have to be in a certain geographic region. You have to, whatever the rule might be there.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to grant permissions than to rescind permissions. So I want to start with a minimal set of permissions, and I want to work with the business units to determine what the ideal set of permissions should look like. And we'll add some, test it, maybe add a few more and test it. The worst thing you can do is open something to the whole company for all forms of devices, and then sit back and wait for bad things to happen, and then figure out which permissions you need to rescind to keep that bad thing from happening a second time. I don't want it to happen the first time. So it does mean there's going to be a little bit of iteration as we fine tune these controls. But the iteration comes from the fact that people who need access to this stuff aren't always in the same spot at the same time. The business units are demanding flexible work. Well, the business units need to participate in the mechanisms that are required to allow that flexible work to transpire safely. So yeah, if you're going to do data classification, don't do it by yourself in the IT department. Get the BUs involved. If you're going to use something like ZTNA to mediate access between humans and apps, get the owner of the app involved, so that together you can determine what the ideal access control should be and what the conditions are that should have shades of access somewhere between allow or block. It's more work, but hey, nobody said flexible styles in modern business is going to be easy. And I think what we're witnessing here is an example of how it isn't so easy anymore.
Yeah. All right. So let's as we wrap this episode up, because this has been a lot of interesting stuff to run around in my head. Because I haven't done this in a while. What's the longevity of this solution? Like, because I always think about, or try to anyway, the time horizon for the effectiveness of something like this, right? Because VPN had a long run.
Yeah.
And then it's sort of like, I picture it like a bottle rocket, the long whistle and then boom, gone. Right? What is SSE, Secure Service Edge? Am I getting that right? Yeah.
Yep.
What's the longevity? Does this thing survive the next major evolution in tech? What is this? What's the future? Where are we on the, I guess, on the evolution development of this thing?
I think we're on a path that's here to stay for some time, unless we agree that we're going to revert to the work styles of what, 5 years ago? Well, maybe more like 10 or 15 years ago. You know, I know plenty of people in my generation, Generation X, who are like, I ain't ever going back to the office again. And we know that's even more prevalent in the younger ones, right? So I see in the long term that work will happen everywhere, all the time, everywhere, all at once, all the time. Maybe, I don't know.
That's a movie.
And
Nice
that,
try.
yeah, and that we are now, those of us involved in this, we get to create this tech and the processes that surround that tech. And one of the things that we all need to do, and maybe we aren't doing a good enough job of it, Rafal, I'll grant you that, is envisioning how do we do this for the long haul.
How do you
That's
keep
interesting.
evolving?
I'm gonna have to think about that a little while longer. How do we give these new ideas the staying power?
That's right.
The old ones did. Did the old ones stick around so long because they had merit, or because it was the only way we knew?
I'm gonna
Or
put my
because the
dollar.
easier way, right?
I'm
Or
gonna
the
put my
easier.
dollar on that. Yeah, it just the one that's the thing we knew, and
Right.
we
I
didn't.
mean, go ahead, Raph.
I was gonna say, it took us so long to get it working.
Yeah,
Nobody
yeah.
wanted to mess with it.
Well, that's
Well,
the thing, right? We have so many people
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
have the knowledge and the experience in that way, right? It's just the way. Like trying to get that switch. And I've said this before on other topics, you know, I mean, when we start looking at compliance things and regulatory requirements, you know, I mean, even the switch off of old school antivirus to go to something that's a little bit more new and upcoming, you know, that's not just going off of existing payloads, is really difficult for organizations to do, because it's like, well, we have to meet this, you know, and PCI says we have to have that, and that doesn't really match the title. Can I switch to that?
Yeah.
So now take that to a whole organizational level of how do we make that change? And you got people have to learn how this actually works the right way, because what's going to happen is you get a lot of people that implement it the wrong way, which doesn't help us very much. But we get a lot of people that implement it the wrong way, but we have to now train everybody on how to do that. When as an organization, I could easily just say, well, we know how to do this. Let's just do it. We can implement it. It'll be cheaper up front, at least. I don't know about long term, but I know the cost of this. Let's just do it, right? Like take the easy route. I think that's the biggest inhibitor for anything that we try to do in the security realm, trying to make some of these changes. Like if you step out there and say it's going to be hard, people are like, yeah, never mind. Like that. That's too much work.
What if we cast the conversation as starting with the outcomes? I want my people to be able to work safely and productivity wherever they are. And then you work backwards. I mean, it's like, you know, you mentioned PCI and these regulations. The regulations are often outcome driven. Protect the data. They don't say install a firewall. Now, they may recommend a firewall, but if there are other ways to protect the data, you've accomplished what the spirit of the regulation has in mind. And I think we can apply that same thinking to much of what we've discussed here today. Start with the endpoint, work backward.
Yeah, I think some of the risks though around that, like compliance wise, is how do people interpret what it says?
For sure.
You know, and that is where you start running into it, because maybe it doesn't say that OWASP top 10 is a standard, but it treats it as a standard. You know, that type of thing where depending on who's looking at it, depends on how they see it. You know, and now you kind of logged like, oh, well, it says this. Like so much of our stuff is interpretation. You know, I could look at something and read it completely different than both of you.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, oh, a security questionnaire. Do I do? Yes, I do that.
Yep.
Sure enough, you know.
Interesting, guys. Interesting. All right, but we do have to cap this episode off, otherwise we keep talking forever. So, Steve, thanks for joining us on the whirlwind tour of this tech. I think in my head, this is one that has to keep evolving as technology evolves. That's one of the things security does terribly is we see it as we've developed a solution to something. We're going to etch it in stone. It's never going to change. This is how it's always going to be. And it doesn't keep evolving. So then it has to it comes to a point where it simply doesn't work anymore. You have to come up with something completely different. And that's that really hard leap we have to make. So incremental steps, I think, is what I think that's where you guys are driving it. So I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, I agree. Hey guys, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me. Hope we can do it again sometime.
We should do that. We'll find another dinosaur to talk about and pick on. So
Indeed.
all right, you guys, thanks so much. This has been fun, folks. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you get to watch this online on our YouTube page, which you are hopefully subscribed to. Check the ID3 tag or the DtSR.buzzsprout.com page for how to find it there. Also, check it out on LinkedIn, on our Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast page. And for myself and James and Mr. Steve Riley, the field CTO over at Netscope with the cool job title and no responsibilities, I think he said.
I didn't say that.
That's what it sounded like, Raph.
That's what I heard.
I have a lot of responsibilities. They're just centered around thoughts and ideas, not stuff.
All right, folks, thanks for listening. This has been fun. Cue the music. We are out of here.